No. So I want to start with a 1-minute introduction to myself, just so that you know where I'm coming from. So I am British born, but spent most of my life in New Zealand. I trained to be a teacher there, and after some years I was able to do some postgraduate work where I studied behaviour analysis amongst other things, and found that most of what I had been trained in as a teacher had no relevance and no basis in scientific research, but found great utility in the business of applied behaviour analysis. When I travel around talking to teachers in the UK and elsewhere, I find that most teachers have not heard of applied behaviour analysis, and even those who have generally have superficial misconceptions about what's involved. I can't possibly hope, in the time we have available today, to talk about all the sophisticated work that's been done in this field. Instead, what I want to do is take a few very broad principles and apply them to what happens in our classrooms. And I hope that it will be the basis of a little bit of discussion, but as I say, I'm very conscious that what I've planned will take a little bit of time. So, we're going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes looking at some theoretical principles. And when I say theoretical, I mean guiding principles. I don't mean that they're imaginary. These are well backed up by research over 6 decades. So applied behaviour analysis is a scientific approach my animations are out of order. Is a scientific approach to understanding human behaviour. And it's distinct from other approaches in that what we say is that it needs to be measurable and observable. If you can't see it or measure it, then it's very difficult to make any scientific conclusions about something. This does not mean, as I originally thought as a teacher, that there are lots of things that can't be measured. I spent the first 7 years of my teaching career repeating the mantra that you can't measure learning. And that's actually not true. Most learning can be measured. Some learning that involves lots and lots of skills at the upper end requires much broader forms of measurement. At the level of solving behaviour problems in classrooms, measurement is in fact a very straightforward exercise if we are clear thinking about what it is we want to address. So the key tool that behaviour analysts use is functional analysis. That is, we observe behaviour in the actual setting and we look at how that behaviour interacts with the setting. What we want to know is what is driving the behaviour. One of the misconceptions that people have about behaviour analysis is that it is focused on behaviour. In fact, it's focused on analysis. It's focused on why the behaviour is happening. And it's focused on whether that behaviour is helpful, and it's focused on how we can help that individual to develop more useful or helpful behaviours. So we begin by looking at what happens before and after the behaviour. And this forms a chain which we call ABC, which stands for, you may have heard of it, Antecedent, Behaviour, Consequence. And all behaviour will be influenced by what has happened previously and what happens afterwards. This is a law of human behaviour. It does not mean that humans are slaves either to antecedents or consequences, but it is inevitable that we will be influenced by them and have to respond to them. And I'll be giving you examples shortly which I hope will help to make that clearer. We not only think about the behaviours that are of concern, we think about the behaviours that we want to encourage instead. In other words, we don't want to achieve statue effects. The statue effect is when you stop all the unwanted behaviours, but you haven't taught the student any more useful behaviours. And I have actually been in a classroom, more than one, where the teacher had taken that approach. Students were doing nothing productive. All that was required of them was not to disrupt or disturb the teacher. And behaviour analysts would say that that is a pointless exercise, and in fact it's cruel and inhumane. And so we want to reduce those behaviours of concern and increase helpful behaviours. I'm hesitant to show you the next slide because I could create more misconceptions than are useful. So I will endeavour to explain this clearly. My apologies. You can attack me afterwards if you wish. So most teachers are more familiar with cognitive psychology because that has been the dominant mode in psychological thinking for some decades. And behavioural psychology is often regarded, particularly by our cognitive brethren, as being soulless, focused on external behaviours and overly simplistic. It's not sophisticated, it focuses on extrinsic reinforcement, it's about punishment, it's about reward. In fact, it's not about that, it's about the influences on human behaviour and how people respond to those. And so our focus is on what is observable. In cognitive psychology, mental processes are inferred from outward behaviours, and then theories are built on those inferences. In behavioural psychology, we take Occam's razor and we say, we're not going to hypothesise something that we can't see or measure. We are only going to look at the actual behaviours themselves. We may well make inferences about what's going on, but we can't use those to build an actual analysis of behaviour. So we analyse rather than infer, and we analyse rather than create an entity that is supposed to exist in the student's mind. So, for example, the behaviourist will look at how often the student calls out in the classroom, what happened before they called out, and what happened after they called out. The cognitivist looks at it and says, this student calls out a lot, there must be something going on in their brain that makes them want to call out a lot. Perhaps they have ADHD, let's give them some medicine. As I said, you can attack me afterwards. I don't have much time. We are interested in motivation, what people are trying to achieve through their behaviour. That's why I said on the initial slide, behaviour analysis is not really about behaviour. It's about why people behave the way they do. And once we know that, we are in a position to do something about it. Until we know that, we're not. Reification is the process of making up something to explain the behaviour. The child behaves badly because they have ADHD. How do you know they have ADHD? Because they behave badly. Yes? You will have had that put to you, I'm sure. And the last one, it's empirical. That is, we are interested in actually physically measuring behaviour. We are not so interested in conjectures or suppositions about what might be going on. Let's stick to the facts, and from the facts we can work out something practical to do. Not only that, we will know whether it's working or not, and if it's not working, we can do something else. If you take an unverifiable reification and you posit that as an explanation for the student's behaviour, and you then develop a theory about how you might go about helping the student, you cannot measure the construct that you are working on. So you cannot measure your impact. Okay, last thing, how am I doing for time? Good. Last thing I want to just touch on before we look at some types of behaviour problems. This is a bit of technical language from behaviour analysis, and it's the kind of language that has led some people to say this is all about trying to control people's behaviour through external consequences. No, it's not. Behaviourists are the people who actually came up and provided the research that showed that if you're using extrinsic rewards, you should only do it to a minimal extent and fade them out as soon as possible. All the work that has been done on the damage of rewards and punishments has been done from a behavioural point of view. There are other people who have got lots to say about it. I'm talking about the actual research. That's how we know. But these things are laws of learning. These are descriptive of what people and other organisms do. So if we take the top column, the top row first, okay, and we look at add. If you add a consequence and the behaviour increases, then you have positively reinforced the behaviour. Okay? It does not matter what you intended it to do. The behaviourist looks at what actually happens. So if, for example, there are 3 students in my lesson who are badly behaved and I give them a detention at lunchtime and they have to sit with me for an hour at lunchtime. And in my next lesson, they are just as badly behaved and I give them a detention and they have to sit with me. And in the next lesson, they are badly behaved and I give them a detention and they have to sit with me. Has the detention reduced or increased the behaviour? It's increased the behaviour. If it's increased the behaviour, my detention has positively reinforced their behaviour. They like spending lunchtime with me. God help them. Yes? And I've seen young teachers do this a lot. You know, you'll have a young, bright, engaging teacher who really cares about their kids, and you've got students in their room every lunchtime who are naughty so they can spend time with Miss. But if I take something away and the behaviour increases, then I have negatively reinforced the behaviour. Many people confuse this and think that negative reinforcement is punishment. No. Negative reinforcement is you're reinforcing the behaviour, you're increasing the behaviour, and you're doing so by taking something away. So if I say that the students have a lunch break detention, but if they work hard, they'll be able to leave early, and they work hard, I've increased the behaviour I want, I've negatively reinforced it by removing the threat of the lunchtime detention. If, however, I add something and the behaviour decreases, then I have added a punishment, that is positive punishment. So if I add a detention and the student's behaviour improves, or the poor behaviour declines, so they're calling out a lot, and I say, if there are any more call-outs, you will have a detention with me at lunchtime, and they stop calling out, the behaviour has decreased, so that was a punisher. Okay? It's just a technical term. I haven't done anything to the student. I haven't imposed any harm on them. Okay? It's just, in technical terms, I have reduced the behaviour through that consequence, through adding that consequence. If I take something away and the behaviour decreases, then it's negative punishment. So if I say that we're going to watch a film if they work hard, and they're playing up, so I take the film away and then they start behaving well, then I've taken something away and the problem behaviour is decreased, So that was a punishment. Oh, sorry, that was a negative reinforcement. Okay? So that's just to explain that chart, and that kind of underlies the discussion that we're now going to have. So there are 6 kinds of behaviour problems. We will see how they come up, how we do for time. So, first one is the joker. The student in your classroom who insists on being the one that everybody laughs at. They've always got lots to say, they are distracting, they disrupt the lesson, and they often do very little work. Is anyone familiar with students like this? No, I didn't think they had them in Sweden. Okay, so we're going to ask these same 3 questions for each problem behaviour. And these 3 problems, if you're thinking about them, if you think about a problem behaviour using these 3 questions, it will help you to come up with sensible solutions, I hope. So, what does the problem behaviour look like with the student? So they are distracting, they're disrupting, and they're off task. So our question is, what's motivating the behaviour? Now the behaviourist will conduct a functional analysis by looking at it and studying it in class. Obviously we don't have time to do that. I'm going to give you the 2 most likely scenarios. The 2 most likely things that are reinforcing this behaviour, or 3, are attention, avoidance, or escape. Attention is they want their peers to pay attention to them. They want to be noticed. That's very common. But others that we sometimes miss as teachers are that actually this is an attempt to avoid something that they find punishing. So it may be that they're afraid to show that they're finding the work too difficult, so they make out to everybody that they are clowning. The purpose of the clowning in some cases is not attention, it is actually to avoid the work and look like you're not making an effort. Because it's okay to fail if you didn't try, it's not okay to fail if you were trying. And the third possibility, less frequent but still happening, is that some students will behave like this to the point where they are removed from the lesson because they find the work aversive and they would rather be ejected from the lesson. As I say, this is less frequent, but you will find it particularly with students who have severe reading difficulties. One of their strategies for getting out of an embarrassing situation is to get themselves ejected in some way. Okay, so how do we change those contingencies if those are the motivators? So the first thing we can do is remove the audience. So we can say to the student, I'm going to be getting you to work in somebody else's classroom, or I'm going to be getting you to work on your own. And if audience has been the motivator, then they are going to quickly reduce that behaviour, that disruptive behaviour. If they have been trying to escape or avoid, then it's trickier because that's negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement is tricky. The way that you deal with it is by not letting the student avoid or escape the situation. So that means saying to them, you either do the work now or you will do the work later under supervision with me, and you make a phone call home or whatever to get the parents so that the parents understand why the student will be working with them. When the student realises that there is no escape from the work, the behaviour is likely to decrease and they are more likely to attempt to engage with the work. But as I said, if there is a reason for them struggling with the work, you will have to address that. You cannot simply expect them to do work that they find too hard or they have an underlying difficulty. Any comments about that before we move on? I chose the most straightforward one first. I hear the sound of recognition. Okay, interesting. So, what does the problem behaviour look like? Sounds like you can tell me. So, I've said a person who quickly escalates a situation and has dramatic outbursts. Yes. The student walks in like, "Miss, my shoes are wet." "Yeah, okay, have a seat." "No, but my shoes are wet. I got wet on the way here. Someone splashed me in the It's all right. You know, just have a seat, you'll dry out. You're sitting by the radiator." No. And, you know, it has to be a big scene. What is motivating such behaviour? I'm going to put that to you for a moment. Audience participation moment. 30 seconds on. What might be motivating a person who behaves that way? Okay, good. So attention. Yes, that's right. It could well be to do with trying to waste time in the lesson. Although I tend to put that in the category of disruption. This is you'll know the student. It's often a girl. Not always, it's often a girl. But I include boys under the term drama queen. And they will be also reinforced by a dramatic self-narrative. You know? There's a story that they're telling in their life about how things never go right for them. And nobody's looking out, and people just don't understand me because I'm 15 and beautiful, and if only they understood that. So often the dramatic outburst is an attempt to reinforce that dramatic self-narrative. So there's something internal going on that you've got to deal with as well as the external. You see what I mean about how behaviour analysis is not just about what's going on outside the person. So how do we change those contingencies? Now, I'm not suggesting that you can get instant and dramatic results, but the first thing is we engage in extinction. We remove the reinforcement. And that means that when the person is exploding and having their scene, we damp down the responses, we defuse. So that instead of reacting to that and making the situation more dramatic and tense, we simply get more and more relaxed and neutral and then look totally bored. Which often is not difficult, actually. And just go, just going, yeah, thank you, have a seat, please. And we're just going to carry on with the lesson now. And, you could call it tactical ignoring. The technical name is extinction. You're simply removing the reinforcement. You also have to school their classmates into also ignoring them. Because they will have friends who want to join in. Okay? And if that's happening, then you have to take it a stage further. And you have to remove the audience. And of course you don't want to move your whole class, so you remove that student from the room and you just say, you need to spend a few minutes calming down. Come back when you've calmed down. Okay? We'll discuss this after class. But for now, you need to calm down. No, you can't come into the lesson at the moment. You're too excited and you're disrupting it. So please wait until you're calm. Let me know when you're calm and I'll come and speak to you. Are you allowed to do that in your schools? Are you allowed to tell a student they can't come in?
Yeah.
Good. Good. I hear stories sometimes that say, teachers have less and less control over student behaviour. And of course, the more you minimise student-teacher control over behaviour, the more you damage their ability to actually impart learning. It's as simple as that. If the teacher controls the room, then the teacher is responsible for the amount of learning. If you take away the teacher's control of the room, you can't ask the teacher to be responsible for the learning. Okay. The volcano. The volcano is the person who sits there like this, smoking and brooding away, and you know that an eruption is coming, but you just don't know when. Yeah? This could be your boss as well, okay? You can translate this to other contexts besides the classroom. So, what does this behaviour... I did not mean to be quite so accurate. Okay, so the behaviour is the student or colleague who is full of brooding anger and then it has intense outbursts, you know. They've bottled it up for so long and then wham, out it comes. And it might come out very, very quickly and be directed at someone who was entirely innocent. I'm distinguishing this slightly from bullying, slightly, in that when we're talking about bullying, we're talking about the persistent and deliberate use of power to humiliate or control other people. Okay? In this case, it's a bit more random. And this is the student who says, I have anger issues. Yeah? The student who says, you know, I have an anger problem. I need to go to anger management. Well, yes, they do have an anger problem. And often they'll be angry at perceived injustice. After all, they're teenagers, so the world is full of injustice towards them. But it also has an element often of coercion involved. That they are trying to control a situation or sometimes escape a situation through an angry outburst. And of course this is highly disruptive and it's very uncomfortable for other students and it's very wearying for the teachers to be working with a student like this. And there are both long-term background things that need to be happening that are outside the teacher's control. You can only really manage what's going on in your classroom. So we need to address the antecedents if there are in fact causes of their anger. For example, the student who is living in a physically abusive home. Yeah? They go home, they get beaten up every day. Or they go home and there's not enough to eat. Or they are in a home where their mother is the subject of violence from her partner. I don't know if you've taught students like this. I've taught students who have been in those situations. And so you have a student who's very angry. I can think of a student who was like this and I just hated teaching him. Then I found out what his home life was like. That he slept on the sofa in the living room because there was only one bedroom and his mother slept there. She went out to work at night and he was left home to look after her baby from a father who was nowhere to be seen. So he got almost no sleep. And when he came into school, he was angry, he was frustrated, and he was tired. So it wasn't surprising that he was one of the most unpleasant people I've ever taught. And the point is, you can't control that. All you can do is work with other people who can support the student to resolve that situation. And it's really important that you are talking to colleagues who have those abilities or that influence. But what you can do is just remove them from the situation as soon as that happens and show them that if they want access to learning and to social contact with others, there is a standard of self-control that has to be managed. Something else that a behaviourist would probably do here is that they would actually coach the student with self-monitoring and actually give them a little program to help them monitor their own feelings and know when they are likely to explode and to have strategies to deal with that. Which could mean taking themselves out of the room for a short time, but there are also other strategies that can be done. I don't have time to go into that, but the point is that this situation is not one that anybody should be putting up with. It is bad for the student, it is bad for their classmates, it's bad for their teacher, and so we need to take action. We don't just say they're really difficult and leave it at that. Okay. Most teachers at some point in their career, unless they're lucky, have a class where a group of students decide to work together to make life difficult for teachers. This is particularly more common for younger teachers, for obvious reasons. They are more experienced, they are often closer to the students in age, the students sense their vulnerability and they will attempt to gang up on them. And in fact, it's probably most common during people's teacher training in their practical placements. So the problem behaviour is one of coordinated disruption and group harassment. Student calls out, you say, that's not appropriate, and another student calls out and says, no, she was all right to say that, and you say, please don't interrupt. Another student says, you're a useless teacher, they're both calling out and you're doing nothing about it. And you're saying, excuse me, I'm trying to teach my lesson, and a fourth student calls out. By that stage, you know that a group of students in the class, and it could be quite a large proportion of the class at first, is actually interested in seeing how you will cope if they all gang up on you. Is this familiar? And it is difficult to manage, but it is far from impossible. You just have to have that attitude. You have to be a bigger wolf than they are, and a cleverer wolf. So what we do is we look at what is motivating that behaviour. And they will be motivated by, one, can we get power over this teacher? Because that's very reinforcing for adolescents to feel that they have taken the power off the adult and the authority figure. They have challenged for power and they have got it. Once they've got it, they don't know what to do with it. But what matters to them is challenge for power. If they get it, they will actually be less happy and more insecure. It's really important as teachers that they understand that we have the capacity to lead that classroom and that we are the leaders of the pack. I didn't turn my alarm off. So, the other thing that they're doing, of course, is peer affirmation. They want their peers to see them as tough and brave. Oh, did you see how she spoke to the teacher back then? Ha ha, wasn't that fun? And so it's about status with their peers, and it's also about being included in part of the group. So we've got this mixture of motivations that might be at work. How can we change those contingencies? The first thing is that the group thing is really powerful. So we're going to look at removing individual students from that situation. And we don't deal with the group, we deal with the individuals. Because when you deal with them as individuals, all that reinforcement from the peer group is no longer there to motivate their behaviour. So if you're being ganged up on by students, you will never deal with them as a group. What they're expecting is that you'll make a list of names and keep back 8 students at the end of the lesson. And then when you start talking to them about how badly behaved they've been, they'll all gang up on you again. Because they're all trying to show off to each other. So what you do is, you don't do that, you make a list of names, you call home, you get the parents in, you have the students sitting there and you ask them to explain themselves in front of the parent. Or you simply meet with that student at a time of your choosing, you choose, and you can also say that student has been part of a group of students who are badly behaved. You work with colleagues, you spread them around other classrooms, they work individually in those classrooms, and you pick them off one by one. And what happens is you just shift the percentages in your classroom. And after a very short time, most of those students will be on board, and if there is a hard core, then you know who to work on, and you get support from other colleagues to do that. So the first rule with hunting packs is always work on the individuals, not the group. Because the group is what's reinforcing. And then the second one is that they are disrupting the lesson. So if they're not in the lesson, they can't disrupt it. And so as soon as they disrupt, you remove them from the lesson, which means you have to be organised and have somewhere else for them to go. And regardless of what your school's policy is, you can just, if you've got supportive colleagues, you just work with your colleagues. Now, I've worked in schools where you're not supposed to send students out. Well, how am I supposed to run my classroom? Are you going to come and get me? No. So you just say, can I just send Simon to work in your classroom for an hour? And the person says, sure. And next week, can you take Sandra? And you say yes. So the hunting pack is an obvious one, and it's one that can be quite alarming for the new teacher, particularly. But actually, it can be addressed quite systematically. But you do have to be very determined, and you just don't blink. Okay? You have backbone, and you face them down. That's what they want to know. I started at school in London. That was probably the second toughest place I'd worked. It took me a term of students constantly trying to disrupt my lessons. When I came back after the summer holidays, they said, "Sir, you're still here." And they suddenly became, not angelic, but much, much better behaved, because I had passed some kind of a test in their eyes. Okay. I've got 15 minutes left, is that right? Oh, and we're finishing at 10 pages. So, we've got just about enough time. The saboteur. This is a tricky one, because it's really hard to spot. This is the student who orchestrates others to misbehave, but does not actually obviously misbehave themselves. It is a rarer occurrence than the others I've spoken about, fortunately, but if you get the student in your class, you have a problem on your hands. And what you have to do is go into intelligence mode. You gather information. You look at patterns. Yeah? You may even make video recordings of what's happening in your lesson while your back is turned. You take note of the low-level comments that are muttered, and you keep an eye on that student. When you say something to this student, what does that student do? So I'm thinking about a student I had in London, and for 3 years, every lesson he was in, pretty much, there were 6 other students who were loudly disruptive. This student very rarely said anything, he just sat at the back of the classroom and frowned. Yeah? In fact, what he was doing was he was muttering things to the others around him at a pitch that they could hear, but the teacher wasn't picking up at the front of the room. And he was telling them things they could say to the teacher. In his 3rd year, he was part of a group of students who assaulted a boy, and he was eventually ejected from the school. That group of 6 students immediately improved their behaviour and stopped being the worst behaviour problem any of those teachers had seen in that school. The student of the problem behaviour was actually not the 6 students, it was the saboteur who was destroying lesson after lesson after lesson. How do you deal with this? We have to work, we can work out from what's going on that it's about power. It's about being the leader of the pack, but doing so in a way that shows that they are cleverer than the teacher. And it's about enhancing their reputation. And so these things are quite subtle, and it's difficult to collect data on. So what we've got to do is, one way we can collect data is look at the behaviour of the class when they're there, find an excuse to remove them, it doesn't have to be for bad behaviour, and then take data on what the class is like when they're not there. Okay, useful test. And we're probably going to have to collect data over time on them. You will not deal with the student straight away. It will take quite a while. So, the last one is the narcissist. And this is quite quick to deal with, because this is the person who is self-centered, ignores others, oppresses or hurts others, but acts like they're a victim of anyone's offence. And you will encounter narcissists most obviously when they're in charge of you. When they're underneath you, they will often be quite good at making you think that they really like you and are charming. When they're in charge of you, life is much different. The problem with this is that what's motivating is a self-reinforcing narrative about how they are the centre of the universe. described as excessive self-love. And the answer is because it's almost entirely internally self-reinforcing, it's very difficult for you to change the environment to control it. So in this situation, you would not try to give them therapy or manage their behaviour particularly, you simply contain the damage. Okay? So you just set very, very clear ground rules for your whole class, and you hold the narcissist to the same standards. So if they're rude to other students, they are punished. If they are rude to the teacher, they are punished. If they take up too much time in the lesson, they get shut down. But what you can't change is their lack of empathy or their self-absorption. So don't waste your energy trying. A famous psychiatrist once said that the best strategy for dealing with a narcissist is to run in the opposite direction. Okay. So, a little bit of a rush, as I said, quite a lot to get through. The conclusion that I'd like to make is simply this. Being analytical about behaviour is how we demonstrate our concern for our students. We are responsible for the standards of behaviour, and we are responsible for the experience of all our students. And we have to make sure that they don't have to endure horrible behaviour in lessons. Right, thank you for listening. I think we've used this time.